Hello, everybody, and welcome back on 99 Media. My name is Carlo, and today I'm here with Matteo. It's a real honor to have with us Professor John Bellamy Foster, who I don't think needs a lot of introductions, but I'm going to say a few words before our first question. So he's a professor of sociology at the University of Oregon, and he's editor of the prestigious monthly review, which is the, let's say, monthly journal that was founded by Paul Baran and Paul Schweezy. He has published many articles and books in his long academic career. He writes about political economy of capitalism and economic crisis from a classic monopoly capitalism approach that is typical of the monthly review school. He also engages a lot with themes about ecology and ecological crisis and Marxist theory. Today, though, we have invited him to talk about a very important article that he wrote for the November, I think, 2024 issue of the Monthly Review, which is entitled "The Denial of Imperialism on the Left."
The new denial.
The new denial of imperialism on the left, sorry, which we have found very prescient of meaning in the current international scenario. Thank you very much, John, for being with us.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would just like to start with an introductory question that will hopefully allow you to give us a big picture of what is currently going on the left. In your article, you state that up until recent decades, the theory of imperialism was focused around the seminal work of Lenin in 1916, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and the supplements to this analysis put forward by contributions from dependency theory, the theory of unequal exchange, the so-called war system theory, and the most recent global value chain. However, today, this Marxist theory of imperialism is commonly being rejected in large part by, let's say, self-proclaimed socialists on the left with a Eurocentric bias. Could you give us an overview of this theoretical debate, highlighting which might be the underlying differences between the classical theories of imperialism and what seems to constitute a denial of imperialism among the Eurocentric Western Marxists?
Well, Lenin's theory of imperialism, which was most notably is imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was published in 1916, and it's really the most successful theory of international relations, international political economy over the last century. It not only explained the First and Second World Wars, but also gave us an understanding, particularly if you include the half dozen other articles that Lenin wrote on imperialism in the 1916-1920 period. It gave us an understanding of revolution in what we now call the global South. In addition to this, Lenin's imperialism also explained the dissolution of the Second International, which was officially anti-imperialist, but when the First World War commenced, the socialist movements of the various countries in Europe, and of course the United States, they generally sided with their own states against other countries, and so they abandoned all socialist principles. And Lenin also, in his theory of imperialism, dealt with that problem, the problem of socialists abandoning their principles to stand with the capitalist state, or what we call social democratic movements. So all of this was dealt with in Lenin's theory of imperialism, and in his further essays, he talked about the exploitation of the countries in the periphery by the countries in the center, and the need for revolution. Much of this is ignored today, much of what he wrote. But he gave rise in his analysis, this analysis gave rise to, as Carlo has said, to dependency theory, world system theory, unequal exchange theory, global value, chain analysis, and so on. The main anti-imperialist tradition really supplemented and developed an historical context, Lenin's theory, but this is now being rejected. One of the important parts of Lenin's theory, probably the most important, is in distinction from Karl Kautsky, who was the great social democratic leader at the time, and Lenin didn't see imperialism as a policy, but he presented imperialism as a system, and that essentially it was the monopoly stage of capitalism. And in fact, he said in its briefest definition, it's the monopoly stage of capitalism. This was crucially important. However, Lenin's theory presented all sorts of difficulties from the standpoint of more Eurocentric Western Marxism and social democracy, so-called socialists who were nationalists and not internationalists. And you find it constantly being criticized, particularly in the post-Second War Western Marxism by socialists who are trying to find a way around Lenin's theory, despite its accuracy, its power, and the fact that all revolutions, almost all revolutions in the post-Second World War period, adopted these ideas. And today it's even worse in that respect because of the new Cold War against China and really against the global South. There are all sorts of attempts to deny imperialism on the left. And so we have such arguments as one country can't exploit another country, only classes can exploit each other, that the working class is more exploited in the global North and the global South, that imperialism has been reversed, and that this is David Harvey's contention that instead of the surplus being siphoned from the East and South by the West North, now the East South is siphoning surplus from the West, from the North, and there is the argument that China is leading an alternative imperialist bloc, which goes against the whole history and development of imperialism and ignores all of it, as well as the facts on the ground. So all of this is, and much more, is happening. There's argument that workers in the North are more exploited than workers in the global South. All of these arguments are common on the left today and others. So this has presented a crisis for the left. There are a lot of socialists who are now criticizing anti-imperialism on various grounds, and sometimes explicitly calling those who side with the global South the anti-imperialists of fools. The anti-imperialism of fools.
Professor, I can hear some noises. Could you make sure that the headphones and the microphone is not? I don't know if
I could. Unplug the headphone. We should maybe do that whole thing over because I heard all these. I'm hearing all these background noises. I'm hearing them now. Headphones down, but they're not plugged in. I was hearing all these background noises. I'm not hearing them now I'm hearing them. So
you're hearing some background noises.
Yeah, but it's
Okay.
not from this house. It's something to do with the connection. I'm hearing it's like people are talking in the background.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes because there's an audience here, there might be some noise that comes out. Besides that, I don't know if there is a technical issue that I can solve right now.
Yeah.
Unless it is unbearable, I would say to keep on going. We're gonna edit out this little part.
Perhaps
It
you
doesn't affect me, but I just wondered if it's in the recording. I don't know.
No, the recording seems fine. I mean, the audio is not the highest quality, but I think it's understandable. Yes, it's almost understandable.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have to keep our mind.
All right, I think we can just. I'm gonna edit out these 2 minutes. So if we can now move on to the second question, and hopefully it's going to be all right. So. As a second question, I wanted to ask you, earlier this morning, we interviewed Gabriel Rockhill, with whom we have analyzed the category of Western Marxism and the so-called 4 retreats that you enumerated in a dialogue with him on another issue of the monthly review, I think later on in 2025. So first of all, I know that you don't want to call it a Western Marxism, but you would prefer to call it Eurocentric Marxism. But besides this definition, I think that one thing that emerges clearly is the tendency of Western Marxists to reject materialistic analysis rooted in serious class-based categories in favor of positions that are ultimately idealistic. Do you agree with this summary? And could you elaborate on the practical and political results of the so-called 4 retreats that characterize the Eurocentric Western Marxism?
Well, yes, I agree with that. In March 2025, Gabriel Rockhill and I did a dialogue which was published in Month Review in March 2025, and we came up with the notion of the 4 retreats from classical Marxism, and the first is the retreat from materialism. Then there's the retreat from class, the retreat from the dialectics of nature, and the retreat from imperialism. Now, all of these have actually been present for me over my working life and research, and it only came together as a 4-fold retreat, though, in the context of that dialogue in March. But when I first became active as a socialist, I was very, very concerned because I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I came at Marxism basically from an anti-imperialist standpoint, and I was very concerned that at that time in the 1970s and into the 1980s over the retreat from imperialism, even at that time on the European left, and the tendency to be Eurocentric, and of course this was also present in the U.S. left, but to a lesser extent. In the U.S. left, the African American movement is very, very powerful and plays a leading role, and is very consistently anti-imperialist. So it gave that and the very direct role of U.S. materialism, of U.S. militarism, gave the U.S. left a little bit different picture of things. But the retreat from imperialism was very obvious to me, and I wrote about it in the early 1980s. But I also was studying under Ellen Makeson's Wood, who and who was writing a book called The Retreat from Class at the time, and we had discussions about it. And that made a deep impression on me, how socialists were retreating from class already in the late 1970s. In addition to all of this, of course, I was coming at things from a political, economic, and philosophical standpoint that was deeply embedded in materialism. Like most political economists at the time, I was materialist in my orientation, and I also was interested in how Marxist materialism, his materialist dialectic, had arisen out of Hegel. And I was disturbed by the extent to which Western Marxism was going in an idealist direction and retreating from materialism. And over time, my understanding of what real materialism really signified in Marx developed, particularly as I worked in ecology. And the fourth retreat was really what defined Western Marxism philosophically. It was the denial of the dialectics of nature. And the more that I dealt with ecology, which is primary concern, its retreat from the dialectics of nature that seemed to me to be absolutely fundamental. It separated Marxism from science, from nature, from ecology, really from materialism, from the real world. So all of these retreats have been, in my perspective, for a long time, but then in March, Gabriel and I kind of conceived this in terms of the fourfold retreat that characterizes Western Marxism.
Do you want to go for a question?
Yes. When I read your article about the new denial of imperialism in the left, there was one thing that was not really clear to me, because I maybe I'm just ignorant of the history of the Marxist debate around the imperialism. But when you call it the new denial, you say so because there was a previous denial which was different than the current one, or is it another reason why you say this is new? This is something new in the Eurocentric left.
Well, the original denial of imperialism on the left goes back to the Second International and the breakdown of the Marxist movement at the time of the First World War. And the First World War and Second World War made Lenin's theory of imperialism very prominent within Marxism. It explained what was happening. After the Second World War, there was all sorts of tendencies in Marxism, particularly Western Marxism, which was in a lot of ways opposed to Eastern Marxism, or particularly against the Soviet Union. And they started to bring back the denial of imperialism in various ways. For example, Bill Warren tried to use Marx to argue that imperialism was progressive, and to attack Lenin's notion that imperialism was actually destructive towards the global South. So you had all of these arguments coming back. Giovanni Arrighi said, well, we don't need the theory of imperialism anymore. We just have the theory of hegemony. And so then you basically throw out most of imperialism theory. And that was a big step. And you have people coming along like Hart and Negri at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the United States as a unipolar power. Then they came out justifying that or objectifying that as some sort of permanent condition and the elimination of imperialism, which was complete nonsense. But now, when I'm saying the new denial of imperialism, I have more in mind that the new Cold War with China. The denial of imperialism is very connected to bringing the left in line with the imperial state, and we can see this all over the place now, and the imperial state is, for example, trying to destroy the pro-Palestinian movement, the struggle against genocide in Gaza. And even though the working class and the population as a whole let's say in the United States, is now on the side of the Palestinians, favorable towards Palestine, wants the war to be stopped, the powers that be continue to promote it. And there's a portion of the left, of course, a part of the left, and this that supports this. But also, the left is turning China into the enemy. Parts of the left are joining the new Cold War on China and projecting that China is the principal enemy in the world and threat to stability. So this is happening in a historical context, and we have to understand it in that historical context.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. At page 2 of your article, you listed 12 contradictory positions / mistakes emanating from Western Marxism. Now, obviously, we won't have time to go through all of them, but I try to merge a few and to allow you to elaborate on their nature. So one line of theories is basically somewhat denying, I will say, the role of the state as a subject within international political economy. And I think two of these theories can be framed as part of this line of thought. One is the one that says one nation cannot exploit another. And another one is imperialist rivalry and exploitation between nations has been displaced by global class struggle within a fully globalized transnational system. This is a thesis that echoes a lot one author that is pretty famous, or I would probably say infamous in Italy, which is Tony Negri. What would you say about these theories minimize the role of the state in international political economy?
Well, on Negri, I was quite shocked in 2000 when Harvard University Press published Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's Empire. And what shocked me was not so much the book itself, but it immediately received accolades from the entire establishment and foreign policy press in the United States, and from there, the world. So the New York Times, Time Magazine, Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, also known as the Imperial Brain Trust, they all praised the Empire to the skies, and the major TV networks all praised the Empire, this book, to the skies, and they said, well, they actually would say in Foreign Affairs, this is a Marxist book, but they were praising it. And the reason they were, of course, doing that was because the book argued that imperialism was over, that we had an empire which was now horizontal, kind of a flat world hypothesis, as Thomas Friedman later called it, and that there was no north-south hierarchy anymore, that the world was being run on constitutional principles, sort of like a rules-based order. All of this really attracted the establishment, but it was attracted to the fact that the Marxists were denying imperialism. The left, which doesn't usually get this kind of publicity from the mainstream, they went wild-eyed over it. They ate it up and started praising empire as well, like in historical materialism and many socialist register and so on. And yet it was, fundamentally a work that disavowed imperialism. And when Michael, I wrote a critique of it at one time, but when Michael Hart came to the University of Oregon shortly after the book was published, and he was giving a presentation, and at the time I said, well, how could you say in your book that the Vietnam War marked the end of imperialism, which is what they contended, and end of imperialism, the end of imperialist wars. And he said, well, they were just words. I said that. He gave me a post-truth answer. He said these were just words, and I could have used other words to say other things. And the truth isn't really important here. And then he went on to talk about postmodernism. I was just completely stunned. And the audience, which was so enamored with postmodernism, just sort of accepted that. But it's very dangerous to promote that kind of a post-truth perspective. And it's very clear that this reinforced rather than criticized imperialism. In terms of the other issue that you raised of, that one nation can't exploit another, William I. Robinson, I talked a little bit about him in my article. He took that view that Lenin claimed that one nation can't exploit another. I then, demonstrated that Lenin hadn't written frequently about how one nation exploits another, and then that was central to his whole theory of imperialism. But there's an attempt to deny class and nation, and to say, well, it's all class struggle, that nations, that states don't enter into it at all, and this is part of the same phenomenon. And that's the kind of view Robinson, who advocates that sort of transnational. He argues that there's a transnational capitalism, a transnational state, and a transnational class, and that we don't have to deal with the state anymore. We don't have to deal with the dialectic of class and nation, which is a dismantling, intellectual dismantling of the Marxist tradition.
Sorry, there's a few people in the audience. I don't know if you guys want to start thinking about questions. I might go with another one, but then I will say it would be quite nice to open it up. So another classic theory which you debunk in your article, which can be formulated in different shades of gray, is the one that starts by claiming that, firstly, all great power today are capitalist nations engaged in inter-imperialist struggle. And then the next shade of gray is that China and the US simply had rival imperialist blocs, claim that can be followed by what I would call a crass idealistic inversion, such as imperialist nations can be judged primarily on a democratic authoritarian spectrum, so that not all imperialism are created equal, suggesting then that not only China is imperialist, but it's also worse than the US imperialism, up to positions that basically end up echoing the neoconservative positions, such as humanitarian imperialism, designed to protect human rights, is justified. And could you help us unpack the theoretical confusion that leads to these bizarre positions?
Well, Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which is the primary work on imperialism that people read, usually ignoring the rest, even those who profess to be authorities on Lenin's theory, ignore the other half dozen articles that he wrote on imperialism, some written afterwards, where he was dealing with more explicitly with the problems of the global South. But in his Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin is talking mainly about a horizontal struggle between the great capitalist powers for division of the world, for control really of the global South, and control of the colonies at the time. But he's talking about the horizontal struggle that was occurring in the First World War. And behind that was the whole issue of the colonies and the control of the global South. But it's easy to read Lenin's analysis as his theory of imperialism as a theory of inter-imperialism. It's mainly horizontal rather than vertical. And then that's what's happening in some ways, so that you have the argument that China is, that then imperialism is just a conflict between great powers, and China is a great power. So geopolitical conflict in the sense in which it's dealt with within mainstream theory as being the entirety of as being the whole reality, becomes the Marxist theory that suddenly Marxism is reduced to simply geopolitics between great powers. Every great power is imperialist. And of course, China's history is ignored, and you have its revolution is ignored, its development, its socialism of Chinese characteristics and so on, and it's presented as just another capitalist country, just another imperialist state. And the whole history of the West in terms of imperialism is ignored, going back centuries. The great imperial powers of the 17th, 18th century are still as great imperial powers, or 17th, 18th, 19th century. They're the same great imperial powers as today. The nations that Lenin listed as the great imperial powers are the primary imperial actors today, the G7, right? And all of that gets ignored in this Eurocentric view, and you have a situation where China is being said that China is imperialist, while it really has not engaged in wars except on its own borders. And the United States in the Second World War has killed millions of people in wars, and it's got 900 military bases straddling the entire globe. It's invaded over 101 countries in its history. This is to compare China and the United States in terms of imperialism, and it's even worse if you look at the economics. It's patently absurd, but it fits in with the New Cold War perspective, and so you have the left, and it shouldn't surprise us. Part of the left are kind of finding a way to use the language and history of Marxism, even if they have to distort it to reinforce their own imperialist state policies.
All right, thank you very much. Matteo, do you want to go for another one? Or
Yes, I have a question, but if there's someone in the audience who wants to ask something, you can ask. If you are not comfortable asking in English, you can ask in Italian, and we will do our best to translate. If not, I can do my question first, and then if you have something to ask, you can go on. Okay.
you go.
Yes, I have a curiosity. When I read your article, I read that you include Giovanni Arrighi amongst the Marxists who deny imperialism, and I was a bit confused because for many of us, when we read Arrighi and we read that he thinks that we are going through hegemonic cycles of capitalism renewing itself. My interpretation and of other people's interpretation is that those cycles are to be viewed as the empire changing capital, basically, and so it's not so clear to me, at least, why you would be of the opinion that he denies imperialism, or he is the one who is at least he is to be considered amongst those Eurocentric leftists.
Well, there were four great world systems theorists. Emanuel Wallerstein, Samir Amin, and Andre Gunnar Frank, and Giovanni Arrighi, who we really see as constructing world systems theory. And Arrighi, along with the others, made important contributions. But in the geometry of imperialism, which was a very important work, he moved towards the replacing imperialism quite explicitly with hegemony, with the concept of hegemony, which was part of imperialism theory. Wallerstein, in a very important piece in his Politics of the World Economy, had explained the cycles of imperialism very effectively, and the cycles of hegemony, and the notion of hegemony in this sense was a very profound contribution of Marxist theory as a whole. It didn't originate with Arrighi, but Arrighi kind of took it out of imperialism theory to replace imperialism theory, to replace the theory as a whole, and then this created problems. A lot of the denial of imperialism is various kinds of slippages, right? And the hegemony concept, when removed from a theory of imperialism as a whole, becomes more acceptable within the establishment and less revolutionary, let's say, in character. So Arrighi was quite explicit about replacing imperialism with hegemony, and David Harvey, when he wrote his works on the new imperialism in particular, and other works when he wrote on it, he explained, I'm following Arrighi, who replaces imperialism with hegemony, and that's sort of the way one strand evolved. It was no longer necessary to talk about the exploitation of one part of the world by another. You just talk about hegemony by itself. And then that kind of conformed with liberal political economy. I was trained in that in the 1970s under Robert Cox, and there was a whole development of liberal political economy of hegemony, which actually took its ideas from Marxism, but removed the concept of hegemony from the whole imperialism theory. Arrighi was doing the same thing on the left. And so it's what it does is it reduces imperialism to simply to geopolitics. And that's very dangerous. If you look at Arrighi's the long 20th century, he doesn't mention imperialism at all, and he denies the existence of monopoly capitalism. So the whole Lenin's whole systematic understanding of imperialism is gone. Arrighi's innovation was to use the concept of hegemony to make it seem like it was a radical analysis. But if you look at his work, it's almost useless. He was wrong about Japan being the new hegemonic power. He was wrong about China being a neoliberal state. And this is because he threw out most of the Marxist intellectual apparatus.
May I just add something, and that is in agreement with what you just said, but in a way also maybe pushes back on the last thing on China. So the absence of the idea of imperialism in Arrighi, I think it's undeniable. It doesn't mention it in the long 20th century. And I think it also has got to do with his somewhat nebulous definition of capitalism itself, that doesn't seem to be rooted in a new mode of production that is focused on the division between owners of means of production, wage labor, but that now is backdated to start even earlier. And I mean, I do know that also in Marxian classic theory, the emergence of merchant capitalism is part of the primary accumulation and the preconditions for the development of proper capitalism. But something that I don't know, I just wanted to ask if you also think that this is in a way part of a sort of retreat from class that we can identify into the political economy of Arrighi's work. So in a way, basically agreeing with what you were saying. But instead, when it comes to China, though, if you focus on Adam's meet in Beijing, I would say it might be a little bit too harsh to, let's say, label Arrighi in claiming that he would conceptualize China as a new liberal democracy, because actually he sort of opens up to the idea that this could be the end of the capitalist alternation of hegemons and the start of a new, let's say, century which might not be regulated by the same dynamics as before. Hopefully I was clear enough.
No, I agree with that. I probably was unfair to Arrighi there in terms of China. His position was more complex, but he was looking at China in terms of issues of hegemony, and there were problems in terms of the class analysis. He was not using the full apparatus of Marxism because he abandoned imperialism. He was not strong on class analysis. There's no monopoly capital. He wasn't able to, I think, effectively talk about the world system. You compare his analysis to someone like Samir Amin, who did not abandon any of those categories. Amin's analysis was always ahead of, it was always on the edge. It was always on the head of things, and his work just stands up. But he didn't abandon the dialectic of class and nation. In fact, he wrote a book called Class and Nation. He understood about the role of monopoly finance capital. He was probably the thinker who got China right in the sense of capturing its complexity and the fact that we had to recognize the socialist as well as neoliberal elements of China. There was a great deal of confusion during the opening up of China and what all that meant. And so a means analysis stands up, while Arrighi's didn't. I also think that Arrighi had of all those four theorists who founded world systems analysis, I found myself most in conflict with Arrighi from the very beginning, not just because of his view on hegemony, but also his failure to understand the exploitation. He argued that economic crisis in the North was caused by high wages. He took that side of things. Well, the other theorists didn't. He didn't really capture the super exploitation of the global South. So those four theorists, I think Arrighi was actually the weakest. But his work is worth reading, if only so that we can compare it to imperialism theory as a whole and see how a hegemony analysis stacks up with a more totalistic imperialism theory.
All right, thank you very much. I'm currently hearing much noise. I don't know if it's something on your side or not. Last call for questions from the audience. Otherwise, I think we might either wrap it up or ask one more.
Wrap it up. You decide.
Okay, let me have a look. I think. Oh yes, there's one more that it's really sort of like on current events. So if we could just have one last comment from you. One of the most dangerous consequences of this ideological reversal that you diagnose is the delegitimization of the real world anti-imperialist resistance. And we have seen how solidarity with Palestine, with the peoples of Syria, of Iran, or with anti-NATO positions are often branded as campist, campiste for the Italian audience, authoritarian, or even worse. In Italy, we've got this category of rosso-brunismo, which I don't know how to translate in English. Well, you mentioned the theory of sub-imperialism being weaponized to delegitimize countries like China or Iran. Could you clarify about these theoretical missteps, and especially those popularized by celebrities like Art? I guess that you already touched on Art Negri. But they seem to be translating into a new form of left-wing either anarchism or Atlanticism that serves imperialist agendas under such a progressive disguise.
Yeah, the accusation of campism is now very common among certain sectors of the left, and what they say is essentially comes out of this notion that there can be a humanitarian imperialism or a democratic imperialism, and that each state has to be judged according to its level of democracy in accord with the West. So a state like Nicaragua, for example, or Venezuela or China are criticized as not conforming to Western democracy, and Cuba as well. And if you side with them, then you're going against socialist principles. You're a campist. You're just simply siding with one camp against the other. That essentially you're opposing the U.S. and European imperialism, and not looking at the authoritarian authoritarianism of these various states, which justifies partly Western imperialism, or at least its humanitarian action. So, for example, Gilbert Ashgar supported the NATO invasion of Italy, and on the grounds that it was a humanitarian intervention. And as far as I know, still, I mean, even after the intervention, defends that, even though the result has been terrorism and the results for the population have been horrendous. And and he accuses distant anti-imperialists of campism. There's the argument that's come out that if you support the global South and you support China in the sense of being anti-imperialist, that they should be able to have their own autonomy, their revolutions to develop in their own way, that you're a campus, and that you're therefore taking the kind of position that the left took in the Second International, where you took one side over another, rather than attacking all imperialisms or all the imperialism of all states. And I think that's incredibly naive. And it was Lenin and Luxemburg. They stood with the global South, with the colonies. They didn't stand with the Western imperialism that was exploiting them. And to take the same position that Lenin and Luxemburg took is not to be campist or to be anti-Marxist. It's quite the opposite. And essentially, the campist argument is used in order to say, and they'll say, we're against all imperialism. But then the next step is usually to say, we're against all imperialism, but the imperialism of China is worse, and without any evidence, and simply that. So effectively, you end up siding with the imperialism of your own country, and the sub-imperialism concept which was introduced by Marini, in the context of imperialism, in context of, say, a sub-imperialist, a power like Brazil working with U.S. imperialism as a kind of a junior partner almost. That original concept of sub-imperialism has been taken out of that context, and now any country that has any power at all, like all the BRICS countries, that they're all characterized as sub-imperialist. Well, there is some truth to that. I mean, obviously Saudi Arabia or today's South Africa and so on. You can point to actions that might fit that, but it's essentially wrong. They're not really withdrawing surplus from anywhere else. Their surplus is still being siphoned off by the global North. All the empirical evidence indicates that. They are simply developing in their own countries and trying to create national projects. And in this context, they have to try to de-link from Western imperialism to some extent, and often this takes authoritarian forms and so on, and we don't support that. But we have to understand that as the global South nations become more powerful, they have to be allowed some route to national autonomy, to social development, or they will become reactionary and authoritarian. They will, the object of the United States is to keep them in a dependent and a weakened position, and to serve U.S. interests. And we have to support a multipolar world that gives all societies some kind of possibility of following their own developmental paths, and especially socialist paths. If we defend a unipolar world in which the United States is the center and Western Europe are the junior partners. In the United States, in U.S. foreign policy, they call the United States the sheriff, Europe the posse, and England, the United Kingdom, the deputy. So, but we can't have a world like that, and that goes against socialist internationalism. It isn't campism, and it isn't the anti-imperialism of fools to try to defend the conditions of the population of the global South, to find support paths where that lead away from the super exploitation of those populations, which are always revolutionary in some if
All right, thank you very much, Professor Foster. I think we are probably ready to wrap it up. I really wanted to thank you for being with us, and hopefully is the first of a series of collaborations. By the way, I subscribe to the monthly review. I've subscribed a couple of years ago, and I personally can tell you that it really was an enlightening decision. So thank you very much, and I'll contact you again soon.
All right. Thank you for having me on your program.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.